I love to tell the story of unseen things above, of Jesus and His glory, of Jesus and His love. I love to tell the story, because I know 'tis true. It satisfies my longings as nothing else can do. I love to tell the story, 'twill be my theme in glory, to tell the old story of Jesus and His love.
Well, this morning we're going to consider Joseph of Joseph and Mary, not Old Testament Joseph. But we'll be looking at promises. Let me tell you a little bit of a story. I think I've only told this story once in the last 20 years, so if you've heard it, you were one of those few who did. Back in the 70s, I owned an alarm company in Mobile, Alabama. And one day when I was driving outside the city and out in the rural area, driving down to an installation that we had made, I drove by a house that was sitting up on a little hill. It was an old wooden frame house. And this was in the fall of the year. In this wooden frame house, there was a chimney and smoke was coming out of the chimney. And there was a woman, an elderly woman, probably younger than I am now, but back then she seemed elderly. An elderly woman who was hanging clothes on a clothesline. And she reminded me of my maternal grandmother. I mean, when I saw her, she just size and everything and actions just reminded me of my maternal grandmother. Anyway, I drove on down to the installation and finished that. And as I was driving back, she was still outside in the yard doing something. And I just felt that I had to go in there. And so I pulled in and asked, in conversation with her, just asked her if she had a smoke alarm in her house. And she said, no, she didn't have one of those. I said, I'd like to give you one. I will install it in your house, and it'll be a smoke heat detector, and you don't owe me anything, just let me do that for you. And she said, okay. So I installed the smoke alarm, gave her my card, said, if you have any issues with anything, just let me know. The next day, I got a phone call. And she says, I'd like for you to come by and take the smoke detector out. I said, okay, fine, I'll do whatever you want, but may I ask why? She said, well, my son said that he didn't trust you and he wanted that thing out of the house. That leads me to the first question. First question is, when something seems to be too good to be true, what is our normal reaction to it? Probably is. In fact, when we really think about it, we even take the word probably out, don't we? We're pretty sure it is. And that's the way her son was. I mean, he was convinced that nobody would do that. Now, what I told her was, I'm fine, I'm taking it out. Just make sure your son puts one back in. Make him go to the store and buy you one and put it in, and then he'll be happy and you'll be safe and I'll be happy. So anyway, I don't know if he ever did or not. When something seems to be just too good, we don't believe it. We just plain don't believe it. So how do we make this decision whether we're just going to be skeptical about something, or if we're just going to outright not trust it, or if we're just going to trust and go forward? Now, for the woman, it was easy. She trusted me and was willing to let me install that for her and give it to her as a gift, but her son just wasn't buying it. How do we make that decision? Well, how do people, not how you individually, because I don't want to get that personal, but how do people make that decision between being skeptical and trusting?
It's based on your experiences.
Okay.
You know, if you've had a lot of bad experiences, you're going to tend to be more.
So the more bad experiences you've had, the more skeptical you're likely to be in dealing with, and the more similar this situation is to one that turned out badly before, you're not going to be too trusting in that particular one. How else are we deciding to be skeptical or trusting?
What we've been told.
What we've been told even, that's right. So if this message of if it seems to be too good to be true, probably is. I mean, if that's really been drilled into us, then anything that looks a little too good, I'm not going to buy into it. There are scams out there, and there are people who are wanting to take advantage of somebody who is trusting. And in our culture today, it has really gotten worse and worse and worse. And so we become more and more skeptical, less and less trusting. And you don't open the door to anybody. 30 years ago, in most places in the South at least, doors were still unlocked. You go to the door and you don't have any problem meeting anybody coming to your door. And today, it's a little bit different. What about the possible versus the impossible? How do we decide when something is impossible? See, that's why he sits in the back row, because I can't reach him back there. What else? How do we make that decision when something is impossible? Never been done before. Yeah, if you go back again a few years now, and people talked about walking on the moon, there were a lot of people who thought, impossible. That will never happen. Well, that happened a long time ago now. If people had told you 20 years ago about the use of cell phones and how widely used they would be as they are now, most of us would have scoffed and said, that's not going to happen. What we do is we jump a little too quickly to the impossible. It may be difficult to imagine, but that doesn't make it impossible, does it? Have you ever heard you can't square a circle? That's a phrase that was fairly common at one point in time, where people would say, yeah, you just can't square a circle. And it would be used in various ways to say that that's impossible. This isn't going to, you can't change this to that or do it. Squaring the circle goes back to the Greeks. The Greeks posed a question about being able to create a square that has exactly the same area as a circle. Ways that you can do that. But they put a restriction on it. You can only use a straight edge, no measuring on it, just a straight edge, and a compass. For those of you who remember your high school geometry, you may remember that you can take an angle and you can bisect an angle by using only a straight edge and compass. Now that's really exciting, I can tell. However, the Greek mathematicians posed a number of problems. You know, can you do this? And geometry was their forte. And so bisect an angle with only straight edge and compass, okay. Then so we teach high school freshmen to do that. And now they pose the question about, can you, with straight edge and compass, draw a box, a square, that has exactly the same area as a pre-existing circle? You can prove mathematically that that is impossible. You cannot do it using only a straight edge and compass. See, in mathematics, you have problems that are posed. And that's what the Greeks were doing. They were posing problems. And some of them you solve. I mean, so it's like bisecting an angle with a straight edge and compass. So you solve those problems. And if you're doing a PhD dissertation in mathematics, you know, the problem is posed and you hope that it's solvable and you can solve it. It may or may not be, because there are some problems in mathematics, in fact, that are unsolvable. You cannot solve the problem. But when we look at things, we tend to look at them as, can I imagine it? And if I can imagine it, then it's probably possible. But if I can't imagine it, then it's impossible. That's how we tend to look at it. And so you throw this word impossible around pretty freely, because there were a lot of people who said it would be impossible to put a man on the moon. And there were a lot of people who would say that, you know, to have everybody walking around with a cell phone and having 6-year-old kids text messaging, you know, impossible. But in fact, we know that it has happened. And there are lots of things that people are posing today that we might be inclined to say are impossible, but may not be. Let's go back to promises for a second. What about a promise in our culture? How meaningful is a promise in our culture today? If somebody walks up and says, I promise you I'm going to. In general, how meaningful is that? Not very, is it? You can go back a few years and the promise, I can remember the first time I met with underwriters from Lloyd's of London in London. And these guys, this was back in the 80s, And back in the 80s, these guys still would do business on a handshake. I mean, they still felt that your word meant something, and if you promised to do something, and if they promised you they were going to do this, then the handshake had it done. The lawyers can clean it up later. It's not a big deal. We're doing a deal, and we've agreed to it. And the lawyers can put the papers together so that everybody will be happy. But the deal is done. Well, today, they don't do it that way. Nobody does it that way. So the meaning of a promise really has degenerated pretty substantially. Now, when it comes to God's promises, we might understand where a non-believer just doesn't believe any of that. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. When you start talking about God's promises and maybe even talking about specific promises of God, then the non-believer it's all nonsense. But what about a believer? Is it possible that on occasion a believer starts to lose confidence in a promise of God? God has promised something specific. Why would a believer not only not hold on to that promise, but sort of give up on it altogether and say, I'm not sure that that's true? We want people to be able to say that of us, right? That stood on those promises. But in fact, sometimes when things get hard, particularly when things get hard, then believers start to waver on the promise. It's not happening fast enough. It's not happening the way that I expected. And so therefore, I'm not so confident now. I'm not standing now. I'm sort of backing away from that promise. Why do people do that?
It doesn't come in their mind thinking of their time.
Yeah. So if it doesn't happen in my time frame, doesn't happen quite the way that I would expect, or if it's so unusual, so different, then I'm not sure that that's true. When God makes a promise, and sometimes that promise may seem to be impossible, probably most of us have been almost there. I'm not confident that's even possible. But how should we respond when we start to feel that way? How should a Christian respond when they start to believe that maybe that promise isn't even possible?
Continue in the faith.
You have to
Continue.
You have to continue on. Can't back away.
I think we have to see the greatness and the authority of His Word, that He said it, He can do it.
So we've backed away from that, haven't we? When we're starting to lose this confidence, we're not recognizing His power, who He is.
You don't believe in God, you simply believe God.
You're saying it's not just a matter of believing in Him, it is a matter of believing Him, right? Believing the promise.
The time frame, and God didn't put a time frame.
His
said,
timing
"I'm gonna
is-
do something," but He didn't say, I'm going to do it day after tomorrow.
Yeah, that's the big problem that most of us have in understanding what's going on, God's hand in our lives. It is the timing, because we are so limited by our understanding of things, by the time element of our lives, that's where we get into a lot of trouble. I have difficulty phrasing this, but if you have a promise from God that seems impossible, starting to seem impossible, how is that different from when I'm asking God for something that I really believe is impossible? Is there a difference between the two things? God has made a promise, and I'm starting to believe that maybe that's not possible, versus I'm now asking God to do something that I'm pretty sure is impossible, but I want Him to do it anyway. What's the difference between the two?
Well, what we're asking of God is something we want.
Ah, yes, there's the key, isn't it? We're inclined to do this, aren't we? We're inclined to want all kinds of things, and we want Him to take care of our wants. So, God, would you please do all this? And yeah, I realize it's a tough one. And this may be virtually impossible, but you can do it, and get out there and do it. Versus the first part, He's made a promise, hasn't He? He has said, I will do this. I may not do it exactly when you want me to do it. I may not do it exactly the way you want me to do it, but I will do this. And that's a very different thing than me just making my request for my want. And sometimes we confuse those two things. When we start to think that this is impossible for God, it's back to what I really want Him to do versus what He's promised me to do. Why do people break their promises? Happens every day. Why do people break their promises to you?
A lot of times they didn't mean the promise to begin with.
Sometimes they didn't mean it at all. What else might happen?
Sometimes they get caught in situations where it's easier to break the promise than it is to continue on and suffer whatever the consequences are going to be.
They're not willing to pay the price for the promise that they made. Anything else?
Well, there are adverse circumstances sometimes.
Things come up. So in fact, we made a promise that really wasn't phrased very well. Because if you're going to make a promise to do something, there are going to have to be some conditions, aren't there? Can you make an unconditional promise? You can make it, but you may break it. That's right. But people do break their promises, don't they? Does the name James J. Braddock mean anything to anybody? Cinderella Man, all right. You'd have to be a boxing fan to know this. Yes, he was a heavyweight champion, came up during the Depression, and he was known as the Cinderella Man because he went from poverty and total disaster to becoming heavyweight champion of the world. In fact, then lost the championship a few years later to Joe Louis. Braddock was a hero to the American people, a real bearer of hope. Because here was a man who was like they were in the midst of the Depression, going to soup lines and trying to keep his family together and all that, and coming up and fighting for the heavyweight championship of the world. I mean, it was an amazing story. There was a movie made just recently in 2005 called The Cinderella Man. So a lot of it's about the fighting. I'm going to show you a couple of scenes that take place during the Depression time, during the hard times. Because there are a couple of various scenes that deal with the issue of the day about the promises. He has a family, a wife and 3 children. They live in the basement of a tenement building. You'll see they get their electricity shut off in the winter in New Jersey. So it's not a very pleasant situation.
Hey, Rosie Chick, how you doing?
Daddy, Jay's store.
What?
Jay's store.
What's all this about?
See, it's a salami.
Young lady, your brother's in enough trouble without you telling on him. You understand? It's from the butcher's, and he won't say a word about it, will you, Jay?
Marty Johnson had to go away to Delaware to live with his uncle.
Why?
His parents didn't have enough money for them to eat.
And just 'cause things ain't easy, that don't give you the excuse to take what's not yours, does it? That's stealing, right? We don't steal. No matter what happens, we don't steal. Not ever. You got me? Are you giving me your word?
Yes,
Go on.
I promise.
And I promise you, we will never send you away.
Baby. Baby. Look at Mommy. Sweet Lord. Howard's fever was getting worse. And then Rosie started to sneeze.
Where are they, man?
Jim, we can't even keep them warm.
Where are the kids?
The boys will sleep on the sofa at my father's in Brooklyn, and Rosie will stay at my sister's. Jimmy, we can't keep them.
If we can't stay together, that means we lost. That means we're giving up.
I am not giving up. I am trying to protect our children.
May, I promised him. Outside the butcher's, I looked him in the eyes, and I promised him with all of my heart I would never, ever send him away.
Oh,
You can't do this.
you weren't here?
You can't break my promises.
Why is the father's promise to the child? And that's what this whole thing was about. The father's promise to the boy. I will never, make you go away. And yet that's what happened. But why is that promise so important of a father to a child? Almost certainly everyone in here's father probably made him a promise that did not materialize. I don't know you, I don't know your father, but I would bet that almost every father, and for the fathers in here, I would bet that probably almost every one of you has made a promise to a child that was not met. But that promise of a father to a child is really very, very important. Why is it so important? Mothers, you're not off the hook either, but I'm focusing on the fathers. But particularly for a father, why is that promise to a child so important? This child is totally trusting in the parent at that stage until a few of those fall through. Totally trusting. What else?
You can't believe your own family. Who can you believe?
All the trust is here, and so can I trust anybody to fulfill a promise? What else?
That child would look at his father kind of like the Christian looks at God.
Ah, yes. It's our model, isn't it? So you have that father figure as sort of the model we have for God in our lives. For those children who've had parents who were totally untrustworthy and maybe harmed them, then it's more difficult for that child to believe in God, isn't it? The good Christians are talking about God, our Father. Well, Father isn't a particularly pleasant sounding word to some children. So it is important. Let's talk about our story today. The focus is going to be on Joseph. But we have to back up to the idea of betrothal. The Jewish culture, this was a significant step. They become betrothed. There's a formal ceremony that takes place. So they come together, stand before God, and vow to one another that they are going to be faithful to one another for the rest of their lives. Now, this isn't the marriage yet. This is pre-marriage. In the days when marriages were arranged by the parents, this was an opportunity for the couple to get to know one another before they moved in together and became the traditional family. So it was an important time of getting to know one another. Nonetheless, a commitment had already been made that they were considered to be man and wife, just had not come together yet. And this period between the betrothal and the wedding would be at least a year. And again, if you hadn't met your soon-to-be spouse, you would probably appreciate having a year to get to know them before joining together with them. So there is this significant event, and we have to understand that event and how important it is in that relationship, because if the husband and the wife have made these promises to one another, and they've stood together before God in making those promises, now there's an implication that we are faithful to God and we will be faithful to one another in the same way. A significant event, making promises to one another based upon this faithfulness to the God that they were before whom they were standing when they made the promise. That's what's taking place with the betrothal. Promises to one another. So you have expectations of one another, of being faithful to the promise that you've made. So we meet Mary, and we go to Luke for that. Luke gives us the best description of what happens with Mary. God sends the angel Gabriel to Nazareth. So if God's sending an angel out on a task, you can bet that something significant is about to happen. So he sent the angel to Nazareth to a virgin, Mary, who was betrothed to Joseph of the tribe of David. Here you have this described that they are betrothed. They have gone through this ceremony. They are to be joined together at a later date, but now they are basically husband and wife, just not together yet. Promising faithfulness to one another, expecting faithfulness of the other. The angel now speaks to Mary. Greetings, O favored one. Favored one. An angel appeared to you and said, O favored one. Well, you might not be feeling particularly favored that day when he shows up, but he's calling you favored one. Now, what's that mean? And he goes on. God is with you. The Lord is with you. Well, that means to us today, because of the Holy Spirit dwelling within the believer, that means something a little different to us than perhaps it meant to a Jewish person at the time of the birth of Christ. Because they didn't have the presence of the Holy Spirit in every believer the way that we have today. But the angel says to Mary, "O favored one, the Lord is with you." If you're a 16-year-old girl, or for those of you who can't do that, even a 16-year-old boy, and the angel appears to you and says that to you, or even if you're the age you are today and an angel appears to you and says, "O favored one, the Lord is with you," what kind of reaction will the angel get from you? She was greatly troubled, as you might expect. I mean, all this is happening, not an everyday occurrence. You don't know anybody to whom this has happened, do you? Here it's happening to you. She's greatly troubled, and she tries to figure out what this means. Now that I can understand. What does all this really mean? Why is an angel coming to me, calling me a favored one, and in fact, telling me that God is with me? Where is this going? And she tries to discern, tries to determine what this means. Then the angel says to her, "Don't be afraid." Don't be afraid. You have found favor with the Lord. So he's explaining a little bit of it away. He said, you found favor with the Lord. You are special, and you will conceive and bear a son. Now here's a 16-year-old girl, betrothed to be married. Well, I don't know what the age, of course, but I use that as something we can think about. Will conceive and bear a son. She is going to conceive. And now if an angel is appearing to you and saying this to you, you're probably not thinking that, well, 5 years from now, I'm going to have a son. But you're probably thinking, man, something's going to happen here. You will conceive and bear a son. Not only have a child, but the sex is determined. And you're going to call him Jesus. Now, the angel's getting pretty specific here about what's going to happen. You're going to call him Jesus, the Son of the Most High. Now, this is getting serious, isn't it? The Son of God. Now, she's not married. She's going to have a baby, and he's going to be called the Son of God. So the natural question for Mary is, wait a minute, how can this be? Her statement is, how will this be? How can that be? I am a virgin. Perfectly natural way to respond. I don't understand this. I don't understand. How can it be? And then the angel says, the Holy Spirit will come upon you, the power of God has come over you, and you will conceive and have a son. And then he adds, nothing will be impossible with God. Because at this point, this isn't natural, is it? The Holy Spirit's going to come on you, power of God's going to come over you, and you're going to have a boy. Does that make any sense to you? I mean, your parents told you about the birds and bees, right? And that's not the way it happens. So you have to be suspicious about it. This is an impossible event, isn't it? Would we as human beings, given that message to us, have been maybe quick to call that impossible? God, that's not possible. But the angel adds then that nothing will be impossible with God. Nothing is impossible with him. So let's get it back. Just because I don't understand it, just because I can't see the way that it's going to happen, I can't understand the timing of it, doesn't mean that it's impossible. Her response then is, I am the servant of the Lord. May it be done exactly as you have said. May your word come true. She's buying into it, the whole thing. I believe this. Now, that's not an easy thing to do, because when she walks out of there and she is pregnant, and people know that she's pregnant, what's she going to say to them? She's made a promise to Joseph that she is going to be faithful to him. Now she's walking away as a pregnant teen, and everybody's going to assume that Joseph has had something to do with this. So how's she going to explain it away? When she goes to her parents, how's she going to say, hey, Mom and Dad, I'm pregnant, and the Holy Spirit came upon me? How is she going to look at Joseph and say, Joseph, hey, I'm pregnant, and the Holy Spirit came upon me? Now, she can say that. There's no indication that she did. What are people going to think about her? Well, what would people in that culture think of a 16-year-old pregnant, unmarried girl? Not good thoughts. I mean, she would be actually susceptible to being stoned, wouldn't she? I am the servant of the Lord. May what you say be the way that it is. Let it be. Let it be. All right, so now we come to Joseph. What about Joseph? We're going to look at this now from his perspective. Joseph has made a vow with this young woman. After this, she left to go to her relative Elizabeth for the last 3 months of her pregnancy with John the Baptist. She comes back now. She's 3 months pregnant when she comes back. So, we're starting to notice things. And Joseph finds out that she's with child. Mary is found with child. Now, you're Joseph, your betrothed comes back pregnant, and you know that you've had nothing to do with that. Would you assume that she broke her promise to you? Perfectly natural. She broke her promise before they came together, so there's no blame for him. But yet, in the eyes of the community, what about Joseph? Well, there are going to be some who say, well, yeah, it's really Joseph. He did what he shouldn't have done, and so he's as guilty as she is, and maybe we should stone him too. Or at least he's going to be the one who was betrayed by the woman he took to the altar. So not a pretty picture for Joseph. So he considers this, and as he thinks about this, he's a just man. He understands the law, and he wants justice to be done. But on the other hand, he has compassion for her, and he's unwilling to have her put to shame. So the only way that he can figure to do this is to put her aside quietly. Divorce her quietly. Not make a big deal of it. Just divorce her, let her go her way, suffer her consequences, but at least the worst that he will suffer will be to be the one who was lied to at the altar and betrayed. Promise broken. So what has to happen? He has to get to the truth. So an angel of the Lord appears to Joseph. It appears that Mary never said to Joseph what had happened to her. Seems to be much more effective for the angel just to come directly to Joseph and handle this. It appears that Mary has left this in the hands of God. Now, you as a young teenage girl who's pregnant through this period of betrothal, appearing to be immodest and irreverent and betraying the one you supposedly loved, can you stand back and wait for God to handle this? Which appears to be what she's doing. She's standing back and waiting for God to handle this. And the angel is sent to Joseph. The angel of the Lord appeared to him. And he says, take Mary as your wife. Don't be afraid to take Mary as your wife. And then he's going to explain a little bit further. What is inside her has been conceived by the Holy Spirit. It's from the Holy Spirit. You're Joseph. Your parents told you about the birds and the bees, and does this make any sense to you? Well, it's an angel standing there talking to you, so it's not like Mary who would be explaining it to you, but it is an angel. What she is carrying has been conceived by the Holy Spirit, and she will bear a son, and you will call his name Jesus. You will do that. When Joseph does that later on, that is in essence him taking legal responsibility for that son. He's stepping up and saying legally, this is my son. So the angel says, okay, here's what you are to do. Take her as your wife, and when the baby comes, there will be a boy, you'll call him Jesus. And then the angel goes a step farther and says, oh, remember this. I mean, you're from the house of David. Remember what the prophet Isaiah said. The virgin will bear a son, and his name will be called Emmanuel, God with us. So he reminds Joseph of that verse from Isaiah that talks about Emmanuel, God with us. And he says, there's your son. There's your son. And then when Joseph awoke, after that dream, after that statement by the angel, when Joseph awoke, he did exactly what the angel told him to do. He went and took Mary as his wife. So they now go to the next step into the marriage ceremony. But he did not know her, as the sexual side of the marriage did not take place until after the birth of the son. The conclusion here is from 2 Peter. And this is a beautiful passage because he's talking here about faith and knowledge for believers. For those of us who have been chosen, we have been given faith. And in this faith, we have a knowledge of God. A knowledge of God that allows us to understand those promises that God has given us. And the fact that those are great and precious gifts. Those promises of God are great gifts that he has given to us. And they're precious gifts. From that, this is one of those great so that passages. Now, I've mentioned before, I love the passage in the Bible where they give us this, this, and this, so that. All this, so that. We have been given these great and precious gifts, promises of God, through our faith and knowledge of Him, so that, first of all, we're not bound by our flesh, not to move strictly by the flesh in this world, not to be bound by that, but to be able to move beyond that, escape from being controlled, having our lives controlled by our flesh, to move to that more divine nature. And that is basically to do what He's called us to do. He has called us, set us apart, and He has given us something to do. He created us before the beginning of the world, and He has created something for you to do. The to do is not for our salvation, but as a result of our salvation. It's something that we do for Him because He has created us for this particular work. But standing on those promises, we're able to do that. We're able to back away from the flesh, those desires of the flesh and the world, and we're able to move forward into what He would have us to do through the power that He's given us to do it, the Holy Spirit. Standing on those promises, as Tom said at the beginning, when we're standing on the promises, then we're able to be more like Joseph was in our story. We're able to do the kinds of things that Joseph did. And that was to accept God's will, even when it seems impossible. When all this seems to be beyond us, impossible to us, then we have to stand on the promises. He has made wonderful, precious promises to us, and we need to stand on those. And if we stand on those, then we accept that will and move forward in it, even though it may seem impossible. And we pursue His plan, not what the world would have us to do or what we decided we ought to be doing, but it's His plan and His plan for us in particular, as Joseph did. Things didn't turn out the way Joseph thought they were going to go, but he still followed through. And Joseph demonstrated great integrity and courage in being able to do what God then instructed him to do, that seemed, in a situation that seemed impossible, in doing things that really didn't lift him up at the moment in the eyes of the people around him, because it sure looked like they got married here, and let's see, the baby is 1, 2, 3, how many months? Very premature child, wasn't it? I mean, that's what people did. That's what people do today. It's no different. So his reputation was suffering, but he, through integrity and courage, stepped forward to do what God called him to do.
Before the angel, I imagine, from looks of the commentary here, he went through a lot of agony.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, as anybody would. It's a struggle. And so his act was actually sacrificial, wasn't it? I mean, he gave up to do what God had asked him to do. And you can't do that if you're not standing on.
I love to tell the story, 'twill be my theme in glory, to tell the old story of Jesus and His love.